All right, well, it looks like we've got a good group to get started here, so let's begin. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Remote Work and Transportation, Fad or Future. I'm Gina Boss, the Associate Director for Engagement and Education with the Center for Transportation Studies, and I'll be co-moderating the session today with Lisa Austin, who's the Center for Community Connections Supervisor at MnDOT and the Vice Chair of the CTS Planning and Economy Council. Today's webinar is co-sponsored by the CTS 4 research councils and its Education and Engagement Council. Each year, the 5 councils band together to sponsor one webinar on a cross-cutting topic that has broad interest across the transportation industry. If you are interested in learning more about the councils and would like to become a friend to one or more of them, we'll post a link to the CTS website in the chat where you can find more information. So a couple of housekeeping items to share before we get started. To submit a question for speakers, you can use the Q&A or the chat at any time, and we're going to hold questions until the end of the presentation and verbally share them during the Q&A time. If you would like to ask your question yourself, I believe we have the capability for you to raise your hand and we will call on you and unmute you so that you can ask your question. Otherwise, we're happy to ask your questions for you. So this event does meet the continuing education requirements for 2 professional development hours or PDH credits for the engineering community. So if you need a PDH form, send a chat message to all panelists with your name and email, and we'll email the form to you following today's webinar. So next, I'd like to encourage you to mark your calendars for the annual CTS Research Conference that will be held on Thursday, November 4th at the Graduate Hotel. So we're really excited to be back in person on campus, while we also will plan to offer some sessions through virtual access for those individuals not able to attend in person. So we're working on finalizing the general and concurrent sessions, and it's shaping up to be an interesting and informative conference. So we hope we'll see you there, either in person or virtually for part of the conference. Finally, I want to point out a new university white paper that has recently been published and was commissioned by the Twin Cities Shared Mobility Collaborative. The white paper focuses on the role of transportation demand management, or TDM, strategies in managing local mobility with a focus on shared mobility. We sent the link out to the paper with yesterday's webinar confirmation email, and we'll share the link again in the chat. And we thought that the white paper had particular relevance to today's topic and wanted to share it with you ahead of time. So now on to the webinar. Many of us have been attending webinars and events that have featured transportation impacts from the pandemic, which continue today as COVID-19 remains a presence in our lives. However, the focus of today's webinar is twofold. One is to acknowledge the role that remote work has played during the last 16 months and what it might mean for our transportation system and services moving forward. The second is to discuss how the agencies that build, maintain, and operate these systems and services are responding both to their customer needs and to the interests and needs of their own employees. So we've lined up a really great panel today to share information and to answer your questions. So we'll hear from each of them, and then I'll turn things over to Lisa to moderate the Q&A. So I'm first going to introduce each of the speakers and then turn things over to them. Kicking things off will be Adil Lari, who is the director of the Institute for Urban and Regional Infrastructure Finance at the university's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. He previously worked for MnDOT for over 30 years, where he managed offices like research, public-private partnerships, and innovative financing. Next, we'll hear from David Unmott, who serves as the executive director of the League of Minnesota Cities. He leads a staff that serves more than 800 member cities through advocacy, education and training, policy development, risk management, and other services. Dave has more than 20 years working in and with local governments. Following Dave will be Kristen Thompson, the Assistant Director of Service Development at Metro Transit. She oversees operational analysis, scheduling, and service budgeting for the agency's multimodal transit system, as well as initiatives to improve bus speed and reliability. And Kristen has been involved with CTS for a long time. In fact, since she was a student at the U of M, where she earned her master's degree in urban and regional planning. Our final two presenters will be Katie Walker and Dwayne Hill with MnDOT. Katie serves as the department's Director of Innovation and Research. In this role, she is charged with creating a culture where research, innovation, and analysis bring bridges today with tomorrow to improve the quality of life for Minnesotans. And prior to joining MnDOT, Katie served in a variety of roles at state, regional, and local governments. And finally, Dwayne Hill is the district engineer in MnDOT District 1. In this role, he leads planning, project development, construction, operations, and maintenance of the state highway network in northeastern Minnesota. And Dwayne is just a great champion for research and a strong partner for CTS, and we appreciate all of that. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Adil Lari. Adil, take it away.
Great, thank you very much. Well, in 1970s, man, a long time ago, I was system design and then traffic research engineer in MnDOT's Traffic Management Center, which at the time started as the demonstration project. And I believe that the RAM metering and RAM bypass to encourage carpooling and transit use was the solution to deal with congestion. Then in 1990s, I was able to create and lead the offices trying to implement toll roads and congestion and road pricing, believing that those were the answers to deal with congestion. What I found, those could either marginally reduce congestion or were not politically feasible. Next. Can you, next slide, please? Yeah, thank you. At Humphrey School of Public Policy, I had the opportunity to champion and with partners design, brand, implement, and evaluate the largest and most successful telecommuting initiative in the country, which lasted from 2009 till a couple of years ago. The initiative was funded by the state legislature as part of the Urban Partnership Agreement to the tune of more than $3.2 million, during which we had significant marketing and education pieces, including development of e-workplace website. The initiative later was funded by Met Council's Congestion Mitigation Initiative for Phase 2 and 3. The driving force behind the initiative was the belief that we do not have to accept traffic congestion and resulting greenhouse emission. Our Phase 1 evaluation confirmed by independent federal evaluators that the initial $3.2 million initiative had a return of 11 to 1. Not many transportation investment have such a high return. Good thing about telecommuting is that it is a win, win, and win for employees, for the employers, and the community. Next. And then COVID-19 happened, and the world went remote, and suddenly there was no congestion. There are a great number of studies trying to measure the impact of COVID-19 on the workforce and measuring the number of employees working from home. And because definitions are varied, so it is very difficult to compare the data. However, last year, according to Minneapolis Downtown Council, only 12.2% of the 218,000 employees were coming to downtown in the summer of 2020, compared to February 2020. This number increased to 30% this summer, and they are expecting it to increase to 50% by fall of 2021. Global Mobility Report on June 10, 2021 estimated that there was 32% reduction in trips to workplace in Minnesota. This reduction was 42% in trip to workplace in Hennepin County. This is consistent with other studies. We found that the urban areas are experiencing higher percentage of reduction because of the type of employment. One Federal Reserve Bank study found that 35.2% of Americans were working at home in May 2020 compared to 8.2 in February. What I found interesting is that even now, the studies show that only 71.7% of the workers that could work from home effectively actually did for some reason or the other. So there is actually a possibility for additional workers to work from home. Pew Research did a similar work and they found the similar results. Next. But what we found that working from home is not for everyone. There's a difference between workers who can work from home by race. Hispanic and Black workers have much lower percentage of jobs which can be done from home according to Bureau of Labor Statistics. For Asians and white, it is 30% of above. For Blacks and Hispanic, it is below 20%. Similarly, educational attainment of the worker has significant impact on their ability to work from home. People with less than high school, only 4.2%. And for college graduates, hold jobs which can be done at home, 51.9%, so more than 10 times more. Next. Income makes a difference on the ability to work from home as well. According to Pulse survey of census, person earning less than 25,000 has only 12% chance of working from home, while it is 73% for person making more than $200,000 a year. Next. Numbers are remarkably similar in Minnesota as well. Less than 25,000, range of about 18 to 20%, and for more than 200,000, it's around 80%. Next. However, this recession is very different. Recession of 1990, 2001, and 2008 impacted the top 25% of the income earners and bottom 25% income earners at about the same rate. COVID-19 recession is very different. The top 25% whose jobs can be done remotely have bounced back nicely, but the bottom 25% working at restaurants, hotels, theme parks, etc., have experienced job losses of more than 20%. Next, please. And there's a gender issue as well. According to census, women working full-time year-round are more likely to have a bachelor degree than men and hold jobs which can be done at home at higher percentage than men. Women are, however, disproportionately represented in low-income jobs and large jobs at higher percentage. Women also during COVID-19 are dropping out of workforce at higher percentage. It is attributed to reasons like caregiving to elders, childcare availability, remote learning of kids, and believe me not, low priority for workspace at home. Men, kids, and then women in the family get the prime space to work. Some things never change. According to Newsweek, these women stand to lose between $600,000 to $800,000 over their lifetime. To keep women in the workplace, we need to increase availability of daycare and extended after-school programs. However, there might be possibility that workforce flexibility may help the woman in the long run. Next, please. According to American Time Use Survey, American workers were working at home 5% of all working days in 2017 and 18. Federal Reserve Bank with Stanford and University of Chicago in fall of 2020 estimated that 5.5% of work were being done at home in 2019. And they project that increase to 16.6%. A more recent study by Becker Friedman Institute estimated that 20% of all the work can be done at home, will be done at home. Metropolitan Council panel surveyors spring and fall of 2020 estimated that the employees would like to do nearly 2/3 of work at home and believe that close to 70% of the employers will allow that to happen. Next, please. Well, this is a moving 12-month total traffic volume trend. As you can, between 1997 and March of 2021, you can see various dips in the trend, especially during the Great Recession of 2007 and 8, but none was as pronounced as the recent drop. Next, please. Last 50 years, moving 12-month traffic total volumes have experienced three major drops. 1973-74 oil embargo caused a drop of about 2.12%, which recovered rather fast. Great Recession of 2007 and 8 reduced by 3%. It took about 8 years to recover. COVID-19 is something at a quite different scale. Monthly volume dropped by 40% in April 2020, and moving 12-month average dropped by 15.8% by February 2021, now slowly starting to recover. Also, what is unique with this reduction is that the urban traffic volume reduction is higher than the rural. Minnesota reduction was one of the largest in the country, and peak period volume reduction is higher than average daily traffic. Next, please. The INRIX have done some global traffic scorecard. They estimated that time lost due to congestion dropped from 99 hours to 26 hours, which resulted in saving of approximately $51 billion, which average about $980 per driver. Trips to downtown Minneapolis from base of February 2020 decreased from 75% in 2020 to 52% in February of 21. Next, please. COVID sure changed the face of workplace, but things did not happen in vacuum. Changes were happening. Working from home, 3 or more days from home were already increasing. It rose from 0.75% in 1980 to 2.4% in 2010 to 4% in 2018. COVID increased it to more than 50%. COVID-19 caused Medicare to bend and finally approved telemedicine for reimbursement. I remember writing to them in early 2000 for its approval. 5G is being introduced. Zoom is a verb. Zoom Corporation is worth more than $100 billion. Zoom app was downloaded 485 million times in 2020. 3 trillion meeting minutes, probably one of ours as well, and 45 billion webinar minutes. Skype and Microsoft Teams, etc., are vying for our attention and are being used. There are multitude of other technological innovations that support working from home. The impact of processing power and connectivity is creating ever-increasing new apps and business processes such as Uber and Lyft. This ever-increasing speed of change is completely changing the work we live and grew up. This has played havoc with forecasts and plans, which are made simply by extrapolating experience into near and distant futures. Most of the assumptions, tendencies, or habits are not reliable for predicting future. We cannot rely on our experience from when changes are predictable and incremental. Next. McKinsey Consulting Company, which worked with the corporations, recently conducted a survey of C-suite executives asking what level of remote working their organization had and will have. Not a surprise that before COVID, 99% expected more than 80% work to be done at work location. Now only 10% expect 80% of the time is spent at the work location. While very few expect all work to be done remotely, The great majority of the executives envision hybrid work arrangements. They are making these decisions because they found employees' productivity, even engagement increased. Increased engagement is not surprising. A number of studies have shown that due to apps like Facebook groups, WhatsApp, and WeChats, etc., people already have more friends and higher engagement. Next, please. Not all companies envision similar hybrid model. JP Morgan Chase employees will be able to pick one permanent remote day a week, which cannot be Monday or Friday. However, they can ask to work remotely those days depending upon the unit needs. Apple expects employees to be in office Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, and 2 weeks of remote work annually. Google expects 60% to return to original office locations, 20% to different locations, and 20% to fully work from home. Workers who are going to office will have a hybrid model. Well, will this be a new normal? Many raise what happened to Yahoo, Best Buy, and IBM companies which were at the forefront of working from home ideas in early 2000, but changed their flexibility and call employees back to office. People forget that those companies were in serious trouble and were facing existential threats when they changed their models. Plus, technology was completely different. It was pre-iPhone and viable video conferencing and terribly slow internet. Processing power and connectivity has completely changed the world the last 15 years. I believe companies also likely to think working from home as a business continuity strategy. A great number of companies such as Microsoft, Facebook, and our hometown company Target has announced work from home till at least middle of 2021. It will be 18 months or more of work from home. Target recently announced that the employees at downtown Minneapolis are not expected to come back into office till this fall. My contact tells me that it may be not till the end of the year. Maybe it will become a habit, maybe culture change. We do not know for sure. We, however, know that it will not be 2019 anymore. Recently, Fed Chair has stated the pandemic has accelerated existing trends in the economy and society, including the use of technology, telework, and automation. This will have lasting effect on how people live and work. We do not live in the world where it took 50 years for US population to have telephone and 38 years for 50 million people to have radio. Next, please. Never let a crisis go to waste has been attributed to Churchill, Mark Twain, and recently to Rahm Emanuel. System and people have the ability to adapt when they are faced with crisis. Disruptions also provide a window of opportunity to elicit sustainable changes to the system if thoughtful nudges are implemented. Transportation history tells us the government is very reluctant to and faces strong pressure to restore the status quo. Things were somehow different during and after 1973 oil embargo, which lasted for only 6 months. The effects were rather long-term. Vehicle efficiency effort started resulting in CAFE standard, which continues to this date. Speed limits were reduced to 55 mph on the interstate, which lasted till 1995. And nationwide carpooling and vanpooling was encouraged. This resulted in a reduction in per capita fatalities highest in the history of USA between 1973 to 74. The other challenge is the population is rising at the lowest rate since the Great Depression, compounded with more than 1 million additional deaths than normal in 2020. You would expect that during COVID, people will watch just that much Netflix and Hulu. But birth rate also experienced drop of 4%, against largest drop happened in 50 years. This drop was the greatest in November and December of 2020. If you want to sustain the transportation and environmental gain caused by COVID-19 crisis, we need to study what changes are happening and understand which of these changes are sustainable. We need to partner with and encourage those individuals and organizations which are already thinking about making long-term changes. We must strategize how we can encourage others less inclined to make desirable changes. We have already seen that low-income minority communities of women are disproportionately negatively impacted as they have less ability to change and have limited transportation options. We need to develop policy options so that we do not leave anyone behind and create an even wider gap between have and have not. We should revisit the justification behind highway capacity improvement projects to see whether those projects are still needed. Maybe we can save a few $billion. We should also need to figure out how to meet the mobility requirement of disadvantaged communities, especially transits, considering routes serving predominantly Black, Brown, and low-income neighborhoods generally retain a much greater share of riderships than routes serving predominantly white and affluent neighborhoods. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Adil. A wonderful context setting for the rest of our speakers. So with that, I am going to turn things over to Dave.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, for his presentation. And I also want to thank CTS for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I've first wondered just kind of what the role that I would be having in this conversation. And as I listened to Adil in the depth of his data and his analytical information, the contrast is going to be significant from him to my presentation, but I think it's exceedingly complementary. And I appreciate the fact that he went before me and outlined a significant amount of perspectives about research and the analytical side of this. My remarks over the course of the next few minutes are going to be more qualitative, more experiential, more practical, based on the work that I'm doing here as the League Executive Director. Just a quick observation. Gina introduced me just a few minutes ago and mentioned that I have more than 20 years of local government experience. That's actually a lie. I put that in the presentation so people don't think I'm the old guy that's making a presentation. I'm actually knocking on the door of 40. So I don't want you to hear that up front, because you'll think, oh, he's just been around too long and there's someone else that we ought to listen to. So if you see me in the box, you'll see why it's close to 40 as opposed to 20. So I just put that context out there for perspective. What I bring to this conversation is experience as a city manager, a county administrator, a consultant in local government, and now I've worked 6.5 years as the executive director of the League of Minnesota Cities. I did spend a few minutes looking at the list of individuals who signed up for this event. And so just for context purposes, the League is the largest statewide city association in our state. Obviously, there are some other city affiliates that we partner with. We have 835 members of the 854 cities that are in our state. And almost every city is. The only ones that are not are really small cities scattered throughout the state. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation this morning. I'm just going to kind of reflect on some things. So as you put into perspective the presentation that Adil gave, and also the individuals that will follow me, I think the best way to kind of conceptualize or organize my remarks are just to think these are some of the considerations that cities are going through that are trying to make those types of decisions that are investments, not only in infrastructure, but also in broadband technology, which is clearly an infrastructure that cities, counties, and other local governments have in mind. I really wanted to, I also want to piggyback off one of the last comments that Adil made in his slide, never let a crisis go to waste. I worked for Scott County, Minnesota at the beginning of the Great Recession. Then I finished the Great Recession as a consultant with Springstead, now Baker Tilly, doing organizational development work for local governments across the upper Midwest. And I had a chance to do my own studying and evaluating of how local governments responded to that crisis. I want to kind of make an overall point or an overall conclusion here is that, at least from my perspective, and these are my opinions only, not the opinion of the League of Minnesota Cities, is I think we let that one go to waste. As someone who likes to study Redevelopment likes to study how organizations think, work, survive, and how we're made up of. Really, at the end of the day, the local governments, except for what I would describe as a bulk of middle management, really didn't change dramatically as a result of the Great Recession. The bounce back in the economics that happened and followed really brought a sense of normalcy to their work. And so I don't want to characterize my remarks as a waste. Don't get me wrong in that way. But if you think about the opportunity in my generation, I started as a small town city administrator in 1983, and now here I am in 2021 doing this job. I've seen a lot and done a lot. And I think if in my career, if there ever was an opportunity to take advantage of a crisis, it was the Great Recession. And now here, just a few short years later, we have the pandemic, which is even a better opportunity. So I am an advocate for organizational redesign, organizational thinking, and the development of new ways to do local government. And I think this conversation and the conversations we're going to have as a society are really relevant to that. So with that perspective, now kind of get into what I would describe as some of the considerations that are relevant to this. And hopefully I'll have a chance to either reaffirm some of your perspectives, maybe introduce a couple of new thoughts or new perspectives, or maybe introduce some ideas you haven't heard, or maybe introduce some ideas that you don't agree with. All of that is healthy and productive for this conversation. One of my conclusions is that transformational change is happening. It's happening in society, organizations, and families and in individuals. But we just can't conclude yet what is ultimately going to be the end game. And one of the things that Adil said, and I think he might have been saying it in a little more narrow perspective, but I'm going to extrapolate to a little larger degree, is we don't know yet for sure. I don't quote him. I'm going to quote me on that. We just don't know yet for sure where this transformational change is going to lie, not only in organizational redesign, but I think in transit, transportation, and infrastructure. And let me explain from my perspective why some of that is. First of all, as you think about this topic, and I'm guessing and I'm speculating that there are individuals from all over the state that are on this call, the impact of this topic, in particular transit, transportation, infrastructure investment, is really going to vary throughout the state. Certainly right now, you can't identify a particular trend that is long lasting. You can do the data analysis of what's happened pre-pandemic to today. That's really good, and that's Adil's expertise. But in my opinion, what I've learned, and I've done a lot of traveling, even during the pandemic, to throughout the state, both in the fall and recently in the spring, that the impact of this varies by city, varies by capacity, varies by organization, and varies by leadership. You could have one city, 5,000, that's not too far away from another city that's 5,000 in greater Minnesota. And the impact of the pandemic and the potential change is dramatically different. And so it's really hard for me as the leader of a statewide city association to draw up conclusions about the overall impact of what's going to happen, because the uniqueness of this is so dramatic from city to city. Not so much true if you think about the 100 or so cities in the metropolitan area. There are largely some similarities there, but they're different from northern Anoka County to southern Scott, or eastern Washington County to western Carver County, because the nature of those cities are very different. But the same thing is really true. In order to do a really deep analysis into the impact of this, you have to look at the city, the region, the place, and also, and this is hard, the leadership, and I'm going to talk about this in a moment, the people who are leading those communities. One of the reasons I say that is because we learned in our studies and in our conversations with city officials is that the financial impact of the pandemic was dramatically different from city to city. We read about in the headlines in the Minneapolis paper of Duluth and Bloomington and Minneapolis and St. Paul, and those cities, especially those cities that were dependent upon sales tax revenue or hotel, motel, or building permits. Those cities took a big, hard hit quick. And they're coming out of it now. The state money, the federal money, the two distributions of federal money, the CARES Act money and the ARP money have really made a difference and are going to make a difference in the recovery of where cities go. But if you go further out, and we did, there were a significant number of cities. I don't have a number because it'd be impossible for me to know, but a significant number that said it didn't really impact us. We had really no financial impact from the pandemic. Certainly public safety, and certainly emergency management and law enforcement and those kinds of things needed money for masks and for PPE and those sorts of things. But by and large, things continued as is in many of our communities, especially those in greater Minnesota. So the generalization of what this means and where it goes has to be bifurcated or divided by region, by place, and by community. And I think that's an important consideration. One of the things I want to do now is kind of segue to some key considerations, as I mentioned a moment ago. And I have 4 that I want to walk through with some supporting points. The first one is this issue of work from home. So I'm in the office right now. We remodeled 2 floors of our building. We're at 145 University Avenue. It's kitty corner from the Capitol. You may know us. We're at Rice and University if you've been there before. A 4-story building built in the early 90s. And we were going to remodel the whole building in 2020, and we ended up just remodeling 2 floors, the main floor and the second floor, because we had staff intensive on the 3rd and 4th floor, and everybody worked from home. We shut our building down on March 18, 2020, and we are now officially open as of June 14th, 2021, and we tied that official open date to the opening of the state capitol. But people have been coming back in our office slowly and voluntarily ever since early January. And I come and go. I'm in the office part days, and part days I'm working remotely, which isn't really any different than what I was doing prior to that, just me as one individual. But what we found out about our cities is this, and I think it's really an important consideration. Some cities halls never closed the entire pandemic. They never shut their door once. People came to work. There was either one very small, or they had the ability to social distance with masks and so forth. Some city councils aren't back yet, and they're still doing virtual meetings. Some city councils never held one virtual meeting. And so in order to understand the impact of our cities in an aggregate way, you really have to do some analysis of what the data shows of how many of those cities are that way. And why is that the case? Because some cities didn't have the capacity, didn't have the technology, didn't have the computer equipment, they didn't have the know-how, they didn't know how to do it. And some turned on overnight, just like that, like the league and other cities. So it's very inconsistent. Almost all cities now are back to regular council meetings, but there will be hybrid. I mean, the notion of a hybrid meeting is probably here to stay with us forever. How it integrates into the work of cities and meetings and all of that is really something to be determined. So what was the determining factor for remote rework? The culture, the leadership, the ability to transform, and now the wherewithal to stay. It's a generalization, so go with me on that the smaller the city, the more you're located in greater Minnesota, the likely you're going to come back fully non-remote. You're going to come back and almost entirely open city hall. It's going to be exactly the same as before. The larger your city, the more sophisticated it is, the more technology capacity you have. And all likely in terms of city government, you're going to have some hybrid meetings and some remote work that's going to continue forever. The league is going to be that way. We have a policy that says flexibility. You can get your work done. You don't have to be in the office. You don't literally have to come into the office. That's going to segue to one of my other considerations here in a minute. So it really is a function of the wherewithal in a community on the long-term sustaining removal from work. The second consideration I have that goes into these decisions is really the search for workers, the search for a workforce and finding employees. It's really difficult right now, as you know. It's certainly in the private sector and the hospitality industry, and those industries that are trying to recover, they're really hurting for workers. I get calls from colleagues around the state. They can't find public works staff. I mean, law enforcement's a challenge. Read about in the paper every day for the bigger cities. Can't find police officers and so forth and so on. Some of those are for different reasons, obviously, but the basic level of retaining, retracting and recruiting employees, city governments used to have their own market, and now they're tied into the greater economy. And that's something new for us. And there's a lot of frustration out there of how we're going to replace legacy workers and people that are retiring. And it's going to be a significant competition for help. What's going to be a leading indicator of who's going to be successful? Here's what I think. I think it's workplace culture. I think the notion of flexibility is going to be a key consideration. I think health and wellness. That's certainly a goal that I have for my organization and my workforce is focus on health and wellness. And also then DEI, the notion of diversity, equity, inclusion. Some of you, if not all of you, have listened to our state demographer talk recently or within the past couple of years, and the data is pretty obvious. The data is pretty obvious of the nature of the individuals that are entering the workforce, and those that come to an agreement of understanding that there's a great untapped market in the DEI area may be more competitive than those that aren't. The other thing that's truly happening in city government is unconventional careers. You could go back as little as 5, 10, 15 years ago. You could track kind of literally where people came from. Just take a law enforcement officer, you got a BA, or you went to Alexandria where they train, and then you started out in a small city, maybe went to a bigger city or the sheriff's office. There's still a lot of that, but trying to find police officers now, there's going to be unconventional ways. City administrators, typically you got your bachelor's degree, then your master's degree in public administration, small city, bigger city, or whatever. Now they're engineers that are city administrators, public works directors becoming city administrators. St. Louis Park just hired their next city manager from the city of Minneapolis who worked in the regulatory services area. So this notion of unconventional careers is going to be a leading indicator of success in communities. The third consideration I have, a few more, is the notion of customer service. Tomorrow, I'm spending an hour with the Pine County management team talking about this in much more depth in a larger level. But the notion of changing level of customer service, and there's some considerations, for example, real-time information. Cities, I can remember not too long ago when I was a county administrator and a city administrator, when the staff made a report, that was really all the facts that people knew what the staff report was. So having that really accurate was really important. Well, all of you in this WebEx seminar know that individuals do their own research. They can Google things. They're much more creative. There's far more opportunity to learn how things are done. And so staff doesn't have the anchor, if you will, on all the facts. And people are getting their own information in real time. Some of it not always factual, some of it is, and that can create some frustration. Shorter extension spans, it's probably true for all of us in this call. We want something, we want it now, so people don't have time for long drawn out hearings or long sophisticated boring staff reports with a bunch of acronyms that city and county governments use. The social networks are really a leading indicator of public opinion. It's a new phenomenon in our world, and it's been a hard adjustment at times for that. And finally, and this goes back to one of my opening points about structure redesign and reorganization and crisis, I believe, and I think this is true, but how it will play out is uncertain. Traditional forms, distinctions, and differences matter less. I think the public has less patience for that's how we always used to do it, or that's the county's job, we're the city, or that's the city's job, we're the county. I think people want answers. They want information now. They want the facts. A number of years ago, I did a presentation to managers in MnDOT, and it was what people don't care what color your truck is anymore. They don't care if it's or what color your squad car is. People want a response. If it's blue or if it's maroon, or if it's brown, all of these are indications of organizations and places. If people want a response, they're not going to say, well, I live in the city of Eagan and that's a sheriff's squad car. Why are you here? Where's my city police officer? I just think the notion of control and command and structure, it should matter less. It should matter less as we collaborate and partner more and more to deliver the services our people want. The next consideration, and I think this is really critical, is the leadership role of supervisors. And I put supervisors in a broad brush. So I'm an executive director, I'm a supervisor, and then there's managers, supervisors, directors. That whole bucket of people that lead people is that, and it also ties into culture. I think the cities that are going to be more successful are those that are going to want to take more risks. And for example, we just did an updated dress code. Well, it sounds pretty mundane, right? Well, it is, but I'm wearing jeans. I wore jeans once a year maybe to work before the pandemic. And now I have a sport coat, a dress shirt, and a pair of jeans here in the office. And jeans are an acceptable attire so long as there's no important meeting and so forth. But here's the point, not what I'm wearing today. It's that we're going to try this. We're going to try a new policy on how we dress around here. And here are the basic parameters, and we're going to update it in 6 months or a year. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. So I'm really supportive of our staff making decisions that say we're not sure. We don't have to have the entire sphere of the world and understanding of how things are going to be. So let's take a chance. Let's try something new. And if it doesn't work, we'll change it. The second one is, and this is maybe a little weedy, is the role of support staff and the role of administrative assistants. I have an administrative assistant who's an outstanding individual in person, but it over the course of the past 16 months, not having day-to-day access and contact with that person, I've become more self-sufficient. I'm not the best at technology, but I'm more sufficient than I ever was. So at some point in time, this organization, and I think organizations need to study and evaluate their support staff. How does that work? We're reorganizing our entire support staff team when it comes to the mailroom and those kinds of things. And that's all going to be different. More and more people, I think of my kids, 3 kids, all professionals now, they're far more self-sufficient than I ever was. And so the way organizations are going to be made up are going to change in the future. And the last one, maybe it is certainly related to infrastructure and transportation and transit, if you broadly define it. And that's this notion of crisis communication. And the fear that people have of a disaster happening in their community and what happens after that. I mean, just look at this tragedy in Florida that's happening, and the bridge collapse, and a decade or so ago here, maybe longer than that. And there's all kinds of things. It isn't just in law enforcement. It could be a fire, a storm. And we have to teach and train our leaders to be far better at crisis management, because there's disruptors in society. There's people who like to do that purposefully. There's people who respond to things that happen. There's people who are aggrieved, and there's people who just want answers. And so managing a crisis, and there's certainly crises that happen in the nature of the work that we're talking about today. And then finally, just a couple that maybe tag things I thought of as part of this conversation from the pre-meeting we had this morning. One that I think is really broad that will be relevant to this is the issue of how zoning is going to change. How zoning and land use is going to change with respect to buildings and office space and so forth. My son-in-law works for a brewery and a pub, one of the kind of microbreweries, and it's an old industrial park in Minnetonka. And then my wife and I were out this past Sunday, and just in this nondescript office park in Burnsville, there's a new kind of pizza restaurant there with outside seating. It's like, who would ever thought that they'd allow a little kind of pizza brew pub in an office warehouse area? I think just as one example, but it's what happens to the office buildings if we don't come back to work in total. What happens to land use patterns and space and so forth. It'll be great to watch over the next few years. The issue of broadband, equity in broadband is essential for small cities, and for greater Minnesota is more so than the metro, because the metro is pretty strong in that area. That's a key point. And finally, infrastructure projects. I think one thing I'll conclude by saying this, what I've discovered, and it kind of ties back to the variety of how cities are handling this, is that some cities really never stop planning and doing infrastructure. Some put things on a pause and they're on hold. And some people just decided to wait and see what happened with financial recovery. And now that financial recovery is coming and doing pretty well, all systems are go. So it's going to be an interesting field to watch in the next 1 to 3 years. As I opened up, I said transformational change is happening, and it should happen, but the degree by which it ultimately will impact what I do and what you do, I think, is to be determined. And it's hard to draw overall conclusions right now. And if you want to draw conclusions, you really have to go into different sectors, into different communities, into different regions, and into different capacities to understand what it may mean. That's what I have. Thank you very much for letting me make those observations, and I'll obviously stay on the meeting and look forward to any questions, comments, or discussion that's going to come ahead.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Dave, for those comments. And I think just such an important reminder. The thing that really struck me was the notion that the pandemic was not experienced by our local, by our cities, in the same manner across the state, so that as we think about solutions, one size solution isn't going to fit all. And then also just that notion of what are the roles of increased partnership and collaboration among government to deliver services. So great comments, and thank you so much. All right, now I'm going to turn to Kristen, who is going to share a little bit of what Metro Transit is thinking about in these areas. So Kristen, take it.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, CTS, for having me. Let me just get my slides going here and we can dive right in. Okay. Again, thank you so much. This has been such an interesting conversation so far, and I see so much in Adil's comments and Dave's comments that I want to respond to, but I'll start with my content and look forward to the conversation later in the session. So I'd echo Dave in saying that the pandemic is really transforming our industry here in transit And of course, we just don't know what the impacts in the end will really be yet. So today, despite my title, the transit in the future remote work, we don't know exactly what that will look like yet, but I'll share some information about how our system has changed during the pandemic, how we're tracking those trends as we plan to emerge. And then I'll also touch on the telework planning efforts that we have here at the Met Council. As the pandemic arrived in spring of last year, like many organizations, we quickly made changes to our service and to our operations in response. These were really focused in two areas. First of all, focusing on the health of our employees and our riders. We introduced a number of new practices like onboard passenger limits, rear door boarding. We suspended fare collection for a time. We installed operator COVID shields in our vehicles and required face coverings on board, which we still do today. We also made very rapid changes to service. With the state shutting down, we really expected ridership to be a lot lower, so we wanted to respond appropriately to that, but also had some concerns about our ability to deliver service if our workforce should be impacted by illness. So we reduced service to about 65% of our pre-pandemic weekday levels. Because of the onboard passenger limits, we wound up having to then kind of go back and reassign high capacity buses and add some extra trips on higher ridership routes to make sure we were putting out capacity where it was needed. As we entered into fall and then kind of going through today, we've been in more of a period of stability with our service. That reduced demand because of remote work and school closures has continued. But of course, as I mentioned, the social distancing requirements had required additional service capacity. So it's a bit of a push-pull factor there. Last fall, we did return to weekday pre-pandemic levels on most of our core local bus routes. We were really focused on where we were seeing the highest ridership during and before the pandemic. We were focusing on routes that are serving communities that rely most on transit. And also thinking ahead to service to schools and colleges when they reopened. Of course, that wound up happening much later than any of us anticipated. We made some changes to blue and green line service throughout as well. And our commuter express routes is really where we see the continued impacts from COVID. We're keeping those at the levels that we established in June of 2020. Many routes are suspended, but we have kind of a skeleton network that spreads around the freeway corridors in the Twin Cities to provide kind of a baseline of service for folks who are still making those downtown oriented commutes. So our service levels today are about 80% on weekdays of what they had been pre-pandemic. We undertook an equity evaluation of our service during COVID and brought that through to the Transportation Committee and are working on a report that will be published soon. At a very high level, I can say the results showed that our service decisions, even though we had to make them very rapidly throughout this time, ultimately we are kind of centering the needs of our BIPOC and our low-income riders. This map is a geographic way of looking at how our service is distributed now. Each dot represents a bus stop or a rail station, and the size of the dot corresponds with how much service we are operating there. So you can really see the core corridors of Minneapolis and St. Paul emerge, the LRT lines, the metro lines, our high frequency network, where you can also see connection points like transit centers and downtown areas where people are still making a lot of movement between lines. We show ACP 50 areas on this map as a way of kind of relating the service to neighborhoods that are low income and minority. This is just one way of looking at equity, and the council is evolving towards a more complex, nuanced look at that, but this kind of geographic way of seeing it is still convenient in a map format like this. Another way to think about our service is relating it back to pre-pandemic service by route type. So on the left side of this plot, we're saying how many trips are operating today relative to pre-pandemic service. And the BRT, LRT, all our local route types were operating between roughly 90 to 100% of our former weekday service. It's really the commuter-oriented routes and commuter rail that we are still operating less service than we did pre-COVID. These services are really focused on freeway corridors, centered on park and rides, bring people into employment areas, and of course, that's the type of trip that has been most impacted by remote work. You've probably seen the headlines about transit ridership being down during the pandemic. And of course, as a total, that's true. but we do see some really interesting patterns when you break it out by route type. This plot shows our ridership as it relates to pre-COVID levels, each dot representing a day and a line representing the trend. So the commuter express type service is the darker blue at the bottom. We can see that that dropped 95% at the beginning of the pandemic and has really stayed low throughout. I would contrast that to our BRT service. That's the red line you see, which has been a relatively strong performer during COVID and has started to grow again this year. You can see that trend line ticking up. Another way to look at this is to compare ridership from 2019 through today. So 2019 is the green line in each of these graphs, and we have from the top local bus, rail, and express bus. Pre-COVID, the green dots, we had quite variable ridership from day to day with a lot of outliers. In the express bus plot at the bottom, you can actually see a line kind of below the main line, which is Fridays, which are always lower for us on express bus. During the pandemic, the blue line and the red line coming into 2021, the story there is the stability. It really doesn't vary much from day to day. Those who are riding with us are very consistent in doing so. Ridership by time of day has also changed dramatically. Weekdays formerly had a very strong peaks around 7 a.m. and 4 p.m. That's shown in the dotted line there. That's really reflecting the importance of office commutes to our ridership profile pre-COVID. Under COVID, we have a very different ridership picture. It really builds slowly throughout the day. That's the blue bars there, and just kind of one hump with a peak in the 3 p.m. hour. This is actually really similar to weekend travel patterns. People are traveling for many purposes, maybe not necessarily all at the same time, but activity just kind of builds through the day. So this is really reflecting not just the absence of the peak commute, but kind of showing how people are moving around throughout the day to meet their various needs. So how do we take what we've observed during the pandemic and plan to move forward? The topic today was framed for me initially as sort of planning through uncertainty. And I think there's really two stories here. What's not uncertain is that all day and all purpose travel has continued really throughout the pandemic. We're still serving 80 to 90,000 rides per day. These are essential trips. We know that essential workers are disproportionately people of color, and we have been working throughout the pandemic to continue serving essential workers safely. This travel is primarily occurring on the BRT, local bus, and LRT networks. People still need to move around for all kinds of reasons, doctor's appointments and social needs and work and school. So we still see a lot of opportunity for growth in this market. Where the uncertainty really is, and that ties to the remote work theme today, is the weekday 9 to 5 commute market. We really have a lot of uncertainties here. How many people will go back to the offices? Where are they coming from? Will they ride with us? How often will they ride? This was about 30% of our pre-pandemic ridership that we're talking about here. So in fall of 2020, we did a survey of our previously regular transit users who had a registered go-to card. That's sort of the pass or fare card that people use, who had not been riding through the pandemic. So this group really skews towards office commuters. Almost half, 44% of them, noted that the most important reason to return to transit after the pandemic would be to avoid traffic and parking hassles. So we really need to understand what's happening with traffic and parking in order to understand what will happen with transit. So how are we doing that? We have some strategies to work through this uncertainty. First of all is good old-fashioned coordination communication, working with major employers on their return to office plans. So we have a link in with downtown employers, so we communicate with the University of Minnesota, of course, just to understand what they're thinking and where they're headed in the coming months. We're also tracking those key commute indicators, again, using data from our partners to look at parking demand and pricing and traffic and congestion. And I'll show you some examples of that in the next slide. Of course, we also have to plan service around what these indicators are telling us. So of course, 9 to 5 commutes can occur on all types of routes, local, LRT, BRT, as well as the commuter and express routes that I referred to earlier. We still have a lot of service and a lot of capacity out there on most of those route types. So there's plenty of room for folks to come back on board. On the commuter and express side, we're serving key facilities, key freeway corridors, and we'll be monitoring ridership so we can track trends along with the parking and traffic data and be able to respond as people are changing their habits. So one of the ways we're accessing those key indicators is through data that's shared by our partners. Just a few examples here. On the left-hand side here, you see a plot showing peak weekday utilization in the ABC ramps that we are able to get from the Minneapolis parking folks, which we really appreciate. So in 2020, you see the blue line, which drops from 85% utilization down to about 10 when the pandemic began. The 2020 line shows sort of a baseline increase there, and those higher peaks are actually Twins game days. So not reflecting a change in commute patterns, but they're offering discounts to Twins fans to come and park in those ramps. So we're seeing that in this data. Another indicator we're looking at is traffic entering and leaving downtown Minneapolis. For that, we're looking at MnDOT traffic data. There's sensors on the ramps entering and leaving downtown. So this is a publicly available feed, and our data folks are pulling it in and have created these great graphics for us to refer to. You can see, for an example, the I-94 ramp entering downtown, which is kind of the one highlighted on the map there. That one is actually closed right now, so that represents the green line that's plummeted on showing inbound traffic in recent weeks. But on the whole, you can see that most of these paths in and out of downtown are still well below their pre-COVID levels. Switching gears a little bit back to thinking about local service, COVID-19 has really strengthened our focus on improving our service for all-purpose trips, where we've seen that strong ridership throughout the pandemic and where, again, we see that opportunity for growth. So these are just a couple initiatives that we've recently or soon will be implementing to improve service for those types of trips. Just a few weeks ago, we launched a new route connecting Woodbury employers and shopping areas to Sunray Transit Center. Coming up this August, we are adding a new route to our Better Bus Routes program, Route 3, which will have some route simplification and an extension to the North Loop, as well as some stop consolidation and improvements. We're also working through the approval process for our Orange Line connecting bus plan. We know that when the Orange Line BRT line opens later this year, that a lot of folks will be arriving to those stations on a connecting bus route, and we want to make sure those connections are as convenient as possible. We also have some regional solicitation grants coming in the next year or so that will help us to improve frequency on a number of local routes. We know that our metro network really drives ridership. I'll refer back to the previous slide showing ridership. We saw that BRT in particular stayed strong in the pandemic. So we have a number of lines that are under construction right now, including the Orange Line, which will open later this year, the D line, which will open next year, and then the Green Line LRT extension, which is under construction as well. We have many more lines in planning and design. And during the pandemic, we undertook a planning process called Network Next, which helped us to identify and prioritize the F, G, and H lines. So when you look at the lines in operation today, and then all of those planning and construction efforts together, we have a really strong vision for building out the metro network across the region that will offer convenient, fast, frequent service 7 days a week, really allowing people so much mobility to move around and meet all their needs in a way that's very all-purpose and all day kind of travel. Of course, it's not just about the lines on the map and the service we put out there. We really think about transit as kind of a wraparound environment for our riders. Starting with the basics, we need to reassure people coming out of the pandemic that transit is a healthy environment to either continue riding or to come back to riding. In fact, it is. We don't have documented outbreaks worldwide that are related to transmission on transit vehicles. Here locally, our capacity restrictions have been lifted, but the federal mask requirement continues. It's a little bit of a double-edged sword for us because, of course, it keeps our operators and our riders safer, but we know that with mask requirements being lifted around the region, that we may be one of the last places people still have to wear a mask, and that could have some deterrent effect. We have daily cleaning of our vehicles, focusing on ventilation, and participating in industry best practices work so that we can be sure we're keeping up to speed on kind of all the latest developments in this sphere. It's not just about the pandemic, however. We've been working behind the scenes to really improve the customer experience generally. We made some improvements to our next trip real-time information, including improving the algorithms that will be more accurate. We're also continuing to encourage touch-free payments. It's not just, you know, healthier in a pandemic environment, but also faster and often more convenient for riders. So we're rolling out some improvements to our mobile ticketing app and have also been working to expand the transit assistance program. We've worked with our partners to understand needs related to the Metro Pass and other fare tools and some adjustments we can make there. And of course, we can't do any of this without having operators to run the service. So we are really focused our efforts on hiring now. You see the image there. We just had a 2-day hiring event over the last week. You know, the workforce piece that Dave mentioned is really important for us as well, because the workers we can hire are needed to directly operate the service that we can use to serve the region. Of course, in addition to being a service provider, the Met Council is also an employer. Most of our employees are on-site essential, so they're keeping trains, buses, wastewater systems running throughout this whole period. There is a smaller subset of positions that are suited to remote work, mine included, and those folks are continuing to work from home for the time being, although some employees have been returning to the office on a limited basis. That's where I am today. I've been coming in 1 day a week. We are planning for a more significant return to the office after Labor Day. Thinking about it, you know, as sort of a new thing for our organization. We did not have a strong remote work program prior to the pandemic, so we're putting a lot of thought into it. I think the framework we're following, for one, we want to ensure that we're attractive as an employer. We know that a lot of other employers are doing that, and this is going to be important to attract and retain talent. Of course, it needs to be driven by our business needs and have some manager discretion so that we can still connect in the ways that we need to connect and get the work done, and connect to our operating side, because that can be important to connect across those parts of the organization. So we want to balance our strong work culture that we've established, but add some flexibility to the mix that we've learned we can do during this pandemic. So we're introducing a spectrum of schedule options to our staff, from fully in office through a couple hybrid options, as well as remote options. Right now we're working on developing updated policies and procedures, evaluating our facility and equipment needs, like many organizations, thinking about whether we need more hotel spaces or additional teleconference space. I think we're really approaching this with, as Dave suggested, an air of experimentation. We don't quite know what will be changing over the coming 6 months as we see how people respond. Certainly a hybrid workplace is very different from a fully remote workplace. So we're ready to learn as we go from our experiences and from our peers. And so to that end, I believe the next presentation is really focused more on MnDOT's remote work planning. So I look forward to hearing that and then participating in the discussion as we wrap up the presentations. So thank you, everybody, and I look forward to your questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Kristen. And just to comment that Metro Transit, you know, really did a spectacular job over the last 16 months, ensuring that folks still had that option when they had to travel. So kudos to all of you and your colleagues. All right, our final presentation is a tag team today between Katie Walker and Dwayne Hill, and Kristen teed it up to talk about the fact they are really focusing in on how MnDOT is going to work and deliver their services moving forward. So happy to turn things over to Katie and Dwayne.
Great, thank you, Gina. And I'm Katie Walker with MnDOT's Office of Innovation and Research, and I'm going to be tag teaming today with Dwayne Hill, who is my partner in crime, I guess, as we've looked at this long-term teleworking question and issue. I wanted to thank CTS for hosting this today. I think this is a really important topic, and to my other panelists who I think are bringing up some very good issues and topics for discussion as we do try to figure out what this means for us as employees, what does it mean for us as agencies and as broader society, as we've all gone through this significant change over the past 16 months. So turning to what MnDOT did is there was a lot of conversation, I would say a couple months into the work from home order that we got. And at MnDOT, we have about half of our employees were eligible to work from home, and then the other half were not due to the type of job, similar to Metro Transit. So we started to have some internal conversations about, what does this mean and what would it mean in the long term? And we have a lot of tools in place to allow for teleworking, but it wasn't necessarily something that was tapped into on a significant basis within the organization. So we started to talk about what should we do? And we really formed a group to really try to look at what is the opportunity? What can we really learn from the remote work experience as we went through it? So trying to not wait till things are over and then go back and try to figure out what did you learn? It was kind of as we're experiencing it, let's really document this. Let's really think about what are we learning and what should that mean for MnDOT and how can it help position the agency for future success? So we really wanted to look at two primary questions. How can expanding telework post-COVID, what impact could that have in a positive way on recruiting and retaining employees, the health and well-being of our employee, our workforce, to the environment and to our commitment as an agency to sustainability, to think about how it would affect or could positively affect travel and transportation and how we use our systems and manage our systems. And then also thinking about the space that we occupy and how our ongoing operations need to be conducted. And we also wanted to think about how do we encourage expanded teleworking where it's appropriate and where it makes sense for us as an agency. Next slide, please. Thanks, Dwayne. So one of the things we did is we did assemble an internal steering committee. And as you can see, there's a lot of names down here. So it was a fairly large committee. And one of the things we wanted to do with this committee was to really bring together a very diverse group of people from across the agency. So we were looking for diversity in terms of areas they represented within the organization by geography, by race, ethnicity, duration in the organization, whether they telecommuted, and what level they were within the organization. So when we took this proposal, and Tim Sexton was our sponsor, so when Dwayne and I took this proposal to our senior leadership team, and that's what SLT stands for, one of the things they said to us is, we don't want the same group of managers and just office directors talking about this. We really want this work to be done by a more holistic group and by a group that would represent all of those affected inside the agency. So that was a very positive thing for us, and I think really contributed to the success of the recommendations that came out of this process. Next slide, please. And we also grounded this work in MnDOT's adopted goals for teleworking. So there are 3 goals that MnDOT has adopted related to teleworking. And one is that we want to be an industry leader and an employer of choice. We also want to ensure that teleworking has a positive effect on our business needs, productivity, on our performance, and as others have talked about, on customer satisfaction. So to ensure that we are meeting our mission and we are serving our users. And then finally, we also want to use teleworking as an opportunity to improve the environment, to improve communities, and also to improve family, and again, to get back to our staff and our workers. Next slide, please. And one of the other things we wanted to just touch on is that we weren't the only group within MnDOT thinking about teleworking and those teleworking activities. We also had, as you can see on this slide, 6 groups within MnDOT that were all working on various aspects of this teleworking puzzle. So we had some groups working on those short term, right here today, what do staff need, how to work teams, how to, get your office set up at home, all of these things. We also security issues, making sure that our data was secure as we were all working remotely. We also had groups looking at what does returning to work look like? How is that going to be different? How are we going to phase that in? Our long-term telework group was really focused on that post-COVID longer term. We also conducted a worker environment survey so we could understand how teleworking was going for staff, what were their needs, what were their struggles, what were the benefits, what did they like, what didn't they like, all of those kind of things. And then of course, because we are part of the state of Minnesota, we also were doing a lot of work with Minnesota Management and Budget. And I think that was very much a two-way street with MnDOT. We were getting direction from them on teleworking, but we're also using this as an opportunity for us to influence them and provide them with feedback on teleworking and how it could work better moving forward. And next slide, please. So what we did with that large, diverse committee that we had of, I think it was over 30 individuals, is we broke them up into a number of subcommittees so that we could more efficiently do this work. And we focused on human resources as one of the groups, the space and workplace environment. So kind of those space issues that others have talked about. Again, the impact on transportation and travel, thinking about sustainability and public health, equity, diversity, and inclusion were also a big area of topic for us as an organization. And then thinking about engagement and communication. So how do we engage our employees as we think about this issue? And then how do we communicate back with them the status of what's going on and what their future is going to look like? So the subcommittees really were asked to look at each one of these topical areas from the viewpoint of the employee, of the agency, and of the broader society. Next slide, please. And so we came up with a number of recommendations, which Dwayne's going to go into a lot more detail on those for you today. I believe we had 36 individual recommendations, and then we rolled them into 6 main recommendations that came out of this process. In terms of how we got to those recommendations with the subcommittee structure and that steering committee, is we really structured those recommendations to talk about subject, or what is the problem we're trying to solve, or what is that opportunity we're trying to seize upon here. We also talked about the benefits. So what are the benefits of taking this action? We also wanted to make sure that we talked about the risks. What are some of the consequences? What are some of the unknowns? Because some of this we are going into territories that, as other panelists have talked about, we don't know, we can't necessarily predict. But we wanted everyone to understand what might be some of those issues, concerns, or obstacles. And then we also added actions. So this was sort of, what is the action that we need to take to seize on these opportunities? So we really were trying to do that balancing act of how do we maximize the benefits of this while minimizing any risks to our organization. Next slide, please. And I think with this, I'm going to turn it over to Dwayne to walk you through some of these long-term, the recommendations and kind of how we structured that, and definitely looking forward to the Q&A session later and just hearing from all of you with your questions. So thank you.
All right. No, I just want to kind of back up a little bit. So thank you for allowing me to present today. And so my name is Dwayne Hill. I'm the district engineer for the northeastern part of MnDOT in my headquarters offices in Duluth. And in our work in the districts, we have a lot of staff that do day-to-day work in the field where teleworking really isn't an option. And actually, as we've implemented telework in our work at MnDOT in my career, it feels like when we started this project, I looked through all the policies and tools that we had, and it feels like we had everything in place that we needed to transition to telework during the pandemic. But we didn't have the culture that really was supportive of telework. And so to me, it feels like all the work that these committees put together was trying to drive culture change in our organization among our management and our supervision, so to achieve the benefits that we've noticed during the last 16 months. And so these recommendations that were developed kind of help us understand how to make that culture change happen in our organization. And so on, and they're kind of grouped in different ways. And I just thought I'd talk about how they're grouped together. So if I work my way around the slide and look at the one that says telework flexibility, which is really a HR effort to look at our policies and even in bargaining, what's allowed through our contracts to support more flexible work environment. There was a lot of feedback from our subcommittees that really feeds into that telework flexibility recommendation. We had the equity, diversity, and inclusion group that looked at improving health and welfare, making sure that we were treating all different groups in our agency appropriately and equitably. They were really concerned about the power dynamic of supervisors themselves making the decision about individuals, whether they could or couldn't telework. And they wanted to make sure that those decisions were made at a higher management level in a more transparent and equitable manner. We also thought through that telework flexibility group that we could work on recruitment and retention by being able to offer telework or remote work in our jobs. So I kind of work my way around here. I also know that there was a lot of discussion about how teleworking could be used to help promote physical health among our workers, allowing them to be flexible enough to allow time for them to create time to exercise during the day. Their mental health and well-being could be improved by that. Just providing, so another one was looking at accommodating caregivers and broader social groups. So thinking about how we could be more flexible with our work hours and even the way that we design our jobs. So typically it's one person, one job. And so one of the group's suggestions was creating the environment where we could start to think about how you could job share and create that more flexible work environment for individuals that needed that. And some of the other topics that we talked about, the modern work culture design itself. And so is it hybrid is the term that we use? And what does the workplace look like? So we had a group that was looking at the actual office space configuration and thinking a little bit ahead about, well, is it a permanent office for everybody? If you're teleworking, are you going to get to the point where you telework so much that a shared hotel space would work? How would you keep that clean in an environment where we're concerned about health and safety of our employees? So thinking about recommendations for cleaning for those workspaces. And also just trying to achieve the benefits of maybe having a reduced office footprint was really important in that area. Another topic as I look around here is looking at best practices around the country and around our state among other employers. And we did a solicitation for research suggestions or proposals that were related to the pandemic. And one of the research projects is gathering data from employers around the state, looking at how they're planning to evolve in the future based on what they've learned from the pandemic. And I think that's going to be one of those things where we're looking at best practices on kind of a 6 to 12 month basis going forward continuing to scan the literature, continuing to scan the state of the industry so that we can, as a state government, take the best practices, take the things that are working for others and apply them to our work. There was a whole bunch of work that we did on sustainability and environment. So when we talk about system benefits from teleworking, I think we're thinking about how that impacts travel patterns, especially in places where we have congestion. We also recognize that there's reduced facility energy and resource use when we have a portion of our workers teleworking. And during the pandemic, I know from looking at budgets in our division that we saw substantial energy use reductions in our facilities just because we didn't have to adjust the heating and cooling set points to the concerns of employees that were in the buildings. And so as we have a smaller workforce in our facilities, we can extrapolate that we will probably also continue to see those benefits. And we also had a group, our sustainability group was looking at the benefits of reducing our paper use and our copier use and toner usage, and then reducing the business travel costs or emissions, so carbon reduction in our travel, but also even the budgetary impacts of reduced travel is really significant. We transferred a lot of our training to a remote training settings. I mean, even this webinar is a great example of how people can benefit from remote training settings. And there's substantial travel benefits achieved by transitioning to that remote where it's possible. Let's see here. As I look at this, we worked really hard with a group of communication professionals to think about how we engage and communicate with our employees. We wanted to make sure that it wasn't duplicative or wearing on them, but we wanted to get their input and we wanted to get their preferences. So that was really an important factor in how we've kind of continued to talk with our employees about the future of telework, is thinking about how to do this in a way that doesn't wear them out and gives them the right information when they need it. Another one of our recommendations as I look around the circle is capital complex commuter flexibility. And initially that conversation started because a number of our employees that work in the capital complex have to purchase parking permits or parking lot spaces on a monthly basis. And when we transitioned to telework, a lot of those employees were very frustrated that they had to continue to pay that parking fee, even though they weren't coming to work, in order to hold that for the future. And this recommendation is really thinking about gathering a group to leverage the MnDOT employees at the Capitol Complex to create more options for parking, especially options for those that might telework, where it's rather than on a monthly basis, it might be more on a daily basis. And then we also tried to expand that into being more, I'm trying to think of the word, more flexible or more supportive of using other options to get to work. So we wanted to make sure that transit was an option that was supported by our agency, and also walking and biking supported. The recommendation about technology for virtual meetings is something that's really important, especially as we start to think about transitioning to hybrid. So it's really, really effective and easy to use technology like Zoom or Skype to do a meeting and have everyone participate remotely. But as we start to think about where we have some people in the room and some people not in the room, we need to have better microphones, cameras, and that type of technology. And we also need to think really hard about how we make sure that we engage that person that's in the remote setting when you have a group in the room. So how to do those remote meetings or hybrid meetings is going to be a continued challenge and take a little bit of investment. And then one of the things I quickly learned in my work groups is I had 20 truck stations of maintenance employees that were still coming to work every day, and I wanted to communicate with them, but I couldn't because of the health and safety concerns. I couldn't go to their shop to visit with them. And so our initial forays into having a remote meeting with those groups, we learned that we had 8 or 10 people sitting around a desktop computer looking at a small screen, trying to see a PowerPoint slide. And we realized quickly that we needed to provide larger screens in those remote work shops just so we could communicate with the workers. So that was an investment that MnDOT had to make right away at the beginning of the pandemic. Let's see here. What else haven't I talked about? I think the last one that I need to talk about is just understanding. So we had a recommendation that we said was called Gather Employee Telework Interests and Preferences. And initially we tried to coin it open enrollment for telework, but that's kind of confusing with our healthcare open enrollment. And what we really want to do is, before we return to the office, we wanted to know what did people want to do? We kind of knew what our business needs were, but we didn't know exactly what all of our employees' preferences were. So we had done kind of an initial preference survey as part of our return to office effort to kind of get a flavor of the of those that were teleworking, what their preferences were. But we needed to actually have that individual conversation with each one to find out, okay, if you want to telework, how many days a week are you thinking you're going to be in the office versus teleworking? And then what days of the week might that look like? And we're trying to gather that information so we can start to design our future office space and bring people back to work in kind of a logical manner. So that was a really important step in this process. And I think one of the things that we recognize is all of these recommendations kind of feed off of each other. They're all interconnected in one way or another. So although they stand alone, and they were all developed by these individual subcommittees, kind of with looking through the lenses that each subcommittee was looking through, we also had to understand that we couldn't take 16 recommendations and work on them simultaneously. So we're trying to find out kind of these recommendations, which one had the biggest impact, how much effort each one was going to take, and what the priority should be for each of those recommendations. So they're all interconnected, and we're kind of trying to filter those 16 recommendations through to kind of give us direction as an agency. What do we do with this information going forward? And we built this interconnectivity map to kind of try to visually show how they relate to each other, each of those 16 recommendations. And so this was another tool that we used to try to narrow down how we approach the recommendations going forward. And then our final report was focusing in on these key things. So taking all of the different aspects of equity and diversity and HR and policy and forwarding that in the vein of telework flexibility. We knew that that would have a very, very high impact, but it would also have some effort and cost associated with it. That's a cornerstone of many of our recommendations that we have going forward. We also knew that we needed our facility group to work specifically on some criteria for office and workspace configuration. And this is something that's probably going to evolve over time, but we need to start putting things down on paper and starting to talk with our employees about what it may look like so that we can begin to slowly implement slight changes in our offices as people return to work. And then I talked about the employee engagement and communication plan. It was really critical for our employees to know what the future is. I know that my individual conversations with those that were teleworking, there was a lot of anxiety about what return to office might look like. Are we going to just flip the switch and go back to the way that we were prior to pandemic, or are we going to allow them to continue to telework the amount that they would like to? One of the things that really impressed me was we were able to transition to telework in just a couple of days, and we didn't really lose a beat as far as productivity As a group, as an agency, we deliver over $1 billion in construction projects every year. And we were able to do that over the past year, working in mainly a telework situation on the project development end of our business. So then the kind of going down this list, gathering the telework interest and preference is something that we thought was really important and need to be done right away, and basically has been accomplished in the last 2 months. And then technology for virtual meetings. We've made some changes in our districts, in our facilities, and I think the big challenge is going to be yet making sure that our conference facilities will allow for the hybrid type meeting, and then also learning how to make those hybrid meetings effective for everybody. And then the last one is the capital complex and commuter flexibility topic that I talked about earlier. So ultimately, our expected outcomes of this project are to impact MnDOT leadership through culture change to be more supportive of telework, remote work, and hybrid work. We want to lead by example in reducing VMT and impacting the environment and being sustainable. We want to continue to learn regarding effective team building while teleworking and doing remote and hybrid work. And we want to understand the state of the industry because we need to know how changes in business around the state are going to impact transportation needs. With that, I think we're at the end of our presentation, so I'm going to turn it back to Katie and we can get on to questions.
Well, thanks, Dwayne, and thanks all of the presenters. As a reminder, I'm Lisa Austin with MnDOT, and I'm co-hosting this with CTS, and I'm going to lead the Q&A session. So we've got a few questions in the chat. I'm going to start it off with one that really, kind of brings it back to the Center for Transportation Studies. This is all about research, and so what I'm interested to hear is what kind of data or research will be helpful for all of you to monitor and make decisions about telework in the future? And I guess I'll just say this could be anything such as, transit ridership, mode choice, workplace culture. It could be things about climate change or equity. So think a little bit about what kind of data or research would you love to see the academic or the research community conduct in the future to help you make these decisions? And then part two of that question is really, how long do you think that kind of research needs to take place? When will things settle down and we'll be at some kind of new normal? When will traffic modeling be accurate again? People may return to work but drive more when they're not teleworking, and they may start taking transit in a couple of years down the road, or what? How long do you think we should be studying this before we settle on some decisions? And I know both Kristen and Adil had some good data, so maybe I'll start with either one of you to kick us off, and then if others want to answer those questions about what data and information do you need to help you monitor this. So I guess, Kristen, I'll ask you first if you've got some feedback, since you're making some decisions about, Met Council's making decisions about transit, and then we'll see if anyone else has comments. So thanks.
Yeah, put me on the spot, Lisa. That is a really good question. I think we have to strike a balance in transit because we have to respond to changes on the ground that are happening weekly, monthly, quarterly, on an annual basis. But we also, of course, look to long-term trends when we're thinking about our longer-term plans. For example, I mentioned the Network Next study where we are looking at our next BRT lines. Another component of that study, which we actually wound up deferring, was changes and improvements we might want to make on our regular route bus network, so the local and express service. We were in the middle of the pandemic and we thought we can't possibly plan for this. We're just going to put it off. So I think we're using data that's out there now, and we can't disregard it. I know that's often the tendency is like, this is just so crazy, there's no way we should use it. But we absolutely do have to keep monitoring what's happening out there today. But I think it'll be a bit longer before we're saying this is the quote unquote new normal that we can use for longer term planning.
Yeah,
Thanks.
Lisa, there are two things which I would like people to consider. One is that things will change drastically for first couple of years. As you mentioned, it will go up and down. And one of the reasons it will go up and down is that the federal government has put a lot of money in the economy and people have saved a lot of money. So that need to be spent. So first couple of years, all that money will be spent. Think about it. There were $3,200 a year per person was given from federal government, and people save from the other. So that money will be spent. So the transportation or travel will be fluctuating significantly because of that. But then also, I want to point out the research, which is Pew as well as Census has done, that only 72% of the people who could work or who could telecommute are telecommuting, even in the top of the pandemic. So there is still a demand for telecommuting, which is not being met, or possibilities of that. So we should not consider that this is the top, even when the people start coming back to work. There is possibility with that as the technology is changing and AI is changing, that it might be even more people might be working and having a hybrid work environment.
Great, thanks, Adil. Anyone else want to comment on the type of research you'd like to see or the duration of time?
I'll chime in a little bit on a couple things that I think would be interesting or helpful to understand. So one of them is when we think about teleworking and we think about our greenhouse gas emissions, our environmental footprint, all of these things. One thing that I think would be interesting is to understand if there is a shifting of some of that from the office and the employer, how much of that gets shifted to the employee who's now working in their home. So when we try to think about what is our true reduction here, and are there, ways or methods, because I think we would all be in agreement that we would like this, if it's going to be expanded, to be something that does improve the environmental condition. So, you hear some of that, I think another area would be that people are probably already thinking of is what is the kind of the equity impact of teleworking, and is this, while there are many, many benefits of expanding teleworking, we've talked some mental health, some recruitment, retention, some of these things, but is there also the potential for it to exacerbate some of that divide between, the office worker and the non-office worker, and some of this college educated versus non-college educated, and what does that mean? Especially in some of those contexts of employees telling us, I've saved so much money this year by not needing to pay to, travel to work, pay for my parking, buy lunches, do all of those things. So sort of that idea of what impact is that having? And then again and some of the things that Adil brought up in his presentation of looking at who is benefiting from this. And, when you think about by race, but then also by gender, and what does this really mean if women have left the workforce in those larger numbers? Are they going to come back? And what long-term impact does that have on us? So there's just a couple areas that I just came to mind when I was first thinking about what would be some of the things we might want to understand. Obviously, there's a lot of transportation related ones too, that I think other people will probably talk about. So I kind of tried to pick off some that weren't necessarily in the, travel demand and those sorts of areas, but that's also definitely areas that I think we'd want to really understand what is that impact, because when we make decisions on infrastructure, those are 50-year decisions. So it's really critically important that we have good information to base those on.
Yeah,
So
great.
with that,
Thanks,
I'll
Katie.
stop.
Oh, yeah, great. Thanks, Katie. That kind of resonates with some of the things I'm interested in seeing too, that workplace culture, connecting with people that, maybe not only are field workers that you can, occasionally see if you're in the office, but even just your coworkers, right? I mean, if you're choosing to come into the office 1 or 2 days a week, you might gravitate to planning ahead and coming in on the days that that your friends come in with, and it might not be the new employee or the person who's not just like you. And if you're all in the office together, you naturally would connect or go to lunch together, and will this further increase office clicks or the difficulty in having diverse teams even in the same section work together. So yeah, workplace culture is really interesting to me. Anybody else want to chime in on this? Otherwise, I've got a few other questions in the chat. So any data or research you want to see, and over what period of time?
So I'll just chime in one couple of thoughts. In order to do formal research to really ascertain kind of impacts of telework, it takes time. It takes a long time to do that. So you almost have to plan a series of projects starting on 6-month intervals to kind of gauge the state of the practice. So that's one of the things, being a technical liaison on a project that's looking at this, that it's been a year to just get to the point where we're almost finishing collecting data. And my other thought is that one of the things that we talked about in culture change within MnDOT is the benefits to the employer. How do you quantify the benefits to an employer when you have your workers working at home, whether it's productivity, reduced energy use, or whatever those factors are. And I found a factor in a business magazine that we use just to kind of come up with a rough number, but I would love to see someone dig deep into that to help build that business case for employers to really think hard about how it impacts them on the bottom line.
Great, thanks. All right, I'll jump into a couple of the questions in the chat. There's a few of them that kind of get to seizing the moment in terms of making changes that help with some of this sustainability, environment, and VMT things. And I'll go back to the comment, the quote that Adil started with, never let a crisis go to waste. And so one of the questions is about what kind of transportation or land use policies are necessary to leverage this new work from home or other habits to help reduce VMT and do things to catapult us into some things to help with climate change. Another one is, is there an effort to guide demand towards more sustainability choices, sustainable mobility choices? So what can we do to not let this crisis go to waste and get people thinking about using sustainable transportation choices as they maybe start commuting and driving for other reasons after they've been teleworking so much? Anyone want to take that?
I will try to answer to a certain extent. Minneapolis is already, the center city is already changing their zonings. So, but suburb has to start following in that regard, that where people work, between the work and the living. And also that has to change in that regard, because zoning is still talk about, you cannot have offices in this residential area, et cetera, et cetera. So those need to change in that regard. As far as, trips, obviously, I don't think that the total VMT will substantially reduce, but the peak period volumes are going to be reduced. And so that has obviously a major implication for transportation infrastructure. And we need to study and understand what that is going to happen. And we need to seize onto the moment and start questioning all of our investment choices we have made. And as Katie talked about, that we make those decisions for 50 years. And so we need to, I think, put a stop and take a break and look at all those projects and see whether those need to be done.
Kristen, do you have any thoughts on some of this? I know when I was listening to your presentation, hearing some of the plans to focus on the everyday trips and not just the commuter trips, I think helps everyone think about using transit to get around. Maybe some of what Metro Transit is doing will address options for reducing VMT any time of day, not just for commuters. I don't know if there's been any thought to that in the work that Met Council is doing, or if that's something you want to comment on.
Yeah, certainly when we can make service more convenient for people to use for all purposes, that will get them out of their cars. I know, thinking about trip chaining or needing to make childcare drop-offs is what puts a lot of people into their cars for commuting. And so the more we can make transit convenient, you can stop at this stop and drop your kid off and then get back on and continue to your workplace or to your other destination. I think that's a piece of it. I think we also are thinking about convenience of fare payment and fare tools. A lot of systems around the country are actually using this moment to look at fare-free transit. It's not an active discussion here, but think, maybe the monthly pass or the all-you-can-ride pass is less useful to people if they're riding to work less often. But interestingly, in some of the discussions with our MetroPass employers, they still see MetroPass as a huge bargain, and they like to not have to track, oh, I'm riding 3 days a week versus I'm riding 2 days a week. So there's a simplicity element that we have to keep in mind as well.
Lisa, I just want to put a plug in for the Accessibility Observatory. And I think, some of the work that they're going to be doing. So they, in the past, have focused on access to jobs by different modes of transportation. But this next phase of their research, they're really going to be looking at other modes. And I think that information is going to be really useful. So education, healthcare, access to shopping, other types of services that people need. And so I think having that type of data will also, I think, be able to be helpful in planning for the future, not only for the transportation, but I think on the land use side. So where will we get the most bang for our bucks when different types of different destinations that people want to reach, where are those going to be sited and located?
Thanks, Gina. That's great. We should make sure we watch the traffic observatory. That sounds very timely that's their topic coming up. All right, I'm going to jump on to another question. We've got a few about workforce and how will remote work impact hiring, and can filling jobs with people around the country or around the world help some of this workforce need. I'll just expand that a little bit and say, thinking about this whole idea of migrating away from, if you can telework, you could live anywhere, right? So what does that mean? And in any of your organizations, are you going to be allowing people to telework 100% of the time? Are you going to let them live in any part of the state or any part of the country or any part of the world? And how important is it to have your workforce be part of the communities they serve? And then I guess another lens to thinking about that migration is, if some metro people can live in rural Minnesota or in smaller towns, how does that impact the economy in some of these smaller places, both positively and negatively? They could be competing then for jobs in those communities, or they could bring some higher income earners to those places. So think about this whole concept of filling open positions with people anywhere, and what that migration might do to the work you do. Anyone want to take this one? Yeah. All right, thanks, Dave.
I'll jump in quick. I know we're done real soon, so I'll be as fast as I can. Just ironically, about a year and a half ago, we had an employee who was a superstar employee with ours that husband retired, and they wanted to move out west, and she wanted to know if she could keep her job. And after a whole deal of reluctance on Mr. Vision me, I said, sure, let's do it on an interim basis. But here's a bunch of caveats that we have to make sure our work, and then 6 months later, the pandemic hit, and it's like, it was laughable to think about the concern I had about this person doing her job. She's continuing to do her job outstandingly. And so it was like bizarre on my end. It's like, and then we hired a really key job this past July. A city administrator in Crosby is now the assistant director of finance for us, but she focuses on member outreach, which is work with our cities. And I think she's been to St. Paul once, maybe twice, to pick up her computer. The second time was just recently because she was part of an award that we got, and she came down to be recognized. So the reality is that, yes, in fact, certainly at the league as an organization, we're going to allow that to happen. I'm still a little anxious about its impact on the culture and relationships and all those sorts of kind of things we took for granted when people were essentially in the office. And I don't know how it's going to play out. We certainly have to be very deliberative about the engagement, about the communication. All of you know on this call, there's very little water cooler talk anymore, and these impromptu kind of conversations. Everything's structured and organized and scheduled. So I don't know what it essentially means, but I will continue to support it because I think we can find good people and we'll figure out the rest. The second part of your question has to do with the migration. When we did our travels in the fall and the spring, the fall was a little premature yet, but the spring, there are a variety of communities, especially those lake communities, and there are many of those in the state where people have cabins or they want to find a place to work, that are actually literally working from there. And so there is a higher demand for that. And cities are benefiting that because they're spending more money there, they're spending more time there on groceries and restaurants and all those kinds of things. The one caveat that's the obvious one is not all communities are equitable in their broadband and their technology. So if you're in a greater Minnesota city that isn't doing very well in that area, you can't do it if you're in a city, especially our regional centers, Bemidji, et cetera, where they do really well. It's easier to do that. So I'm not entirely sure where the end is on the folks, not having two homes or relocating for parts of the year or longer times of the year in a remote work environment, but it's clearly going to happen, and it's clearly happening now, and it will have an impact on telecommute. It will have an impact on people driving into the office. And it's frankly kind of exciting to see, because Greater Minnesota views as an opportunity and as an economic development possibility. And as you all know on this call, anytime you get something like that for those cities, it's a positive.
Great, thanks. Well, we're down to our last 2 minutes, so I'm just gonna mention a couple other questions. We won't have time to answer them, but I think they're good observations, and then I'll pass it to Gina to wrap us up here. So there's been a couple of questions about looking at the cost to employees, because there may be savings that the employer has, but and there's both savings and costs to an employee. Things like maybe you turned your heat down during the day when you went into the office, and now you kept your house warm all day long, or maybe you had to purchase some extra equipment, a printer at home or other things. So thinking about that, and that relates to one of the other questions was, there might be energy savings with the employer turning the heat down, but did that help the community overall? Did energy use go down overall, or did it actually go up in terms of some of those things? So that's kind of a few questions on the employee and some of those benefits or increased energy use and costs. And then I think a lot of a summary to everything is like, it's just going to take time, right? One of the questions was about, does planning or transit modeling, go away now? I mean, we can't predict the future, but maybe we can't predict the future for a while. So maybe it's, 5 years from now, we'll settle into some things. So we just need to be nimble and flexible and pivot a lot for a little while. And with that, I'll pass it to Gina. Sorry, I didn't give you the full minute. I was trying to wrap things up. So
no problem. Thanks, Lisa. I heard from one of my colleagues in the freight community that we were focused on the public sector side for the most part for this. And so I think there's probably more content and more material for a future webinar looking at these issues around freight movement and freight, again, employers. So carriers and shippers as employers. And then the points you raised, Lisa, I think are the questions that were also raised around looking at the cost. So again, some good potential future research questions, I think. So with that, I just want to say thank you to and give, a round of applause to our panelists. Great presentations and really good discussion. Thank you all for attending. And stay tuned for the CTS fall slate of activities. And we look forward to hearing from you and connecting with you in the future. Take care, everybody, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank
You
you
too.
very much.